Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have with us Mark Stern. He is a member of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Brookfield, Illinois. He's an attorney. He is a current delegate to the LCMS convention in July. He served on various boards and committees throughout his time. Used to be in the Central Illinois district, my home right now, and so we miss him even now that he's in NID. But welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Pastor Braaten. It's good to be here.
Yes, good to have you here. The reason I wanted to chat with you, your insight as an attorney, but also your kind of long-standing service on various boards and committees, as well as being a delegate to the convention. I wanted to look at the first version of today's business that's going to be taken up at the convention and just kind of highlight some resolutions that would pertain to kind of the Gottesdienst crowd folk, but also just things to pay attention to in general. So where did you want to begin?
Sure. Well, just to give a little bit of understanding to the listeners, the legislative process in the Missouri Synod starts with what's called overtures. And those can be submitted by congregations, by districts, by institutions of synods, and a few other sources. And there were 374 of those submitted this time. Those are distilled down into what are called resolutions, which are the documents that are actually going to be discussed, debated, and voted on at the Synod Convention by groups called floor committees. Those floor committees are small groups of voting and advisory delegates that are appointed by the president of Synod, and they're usually chaired by either a district president or a Synod vice president that get together, that look at the whole workbook of overtures, decide what can be grouped together, what should be spoken to, what should be revised, and what maybe should be discarded or sent to another location. And the fruits of their work is the first edition of today's business, which is available on the Synod website and lists the resolutions that are currently planned to come forth to the convention. So this is the point at which everybody who's a listener, whether you're rostered, not rostered, whether you're a delegate, whether you're just a parishioner in the pew, you have the opportunity to submit comments and thoughts to the floor committees. And it's especially useful if you're a delegate to understand what's coming down the pike, what you're going to be voting for. So I'd like to share a little bit about some of what I consider to be the more relevant or significant resolutions in the today's business.
Yeah, before we move on to that, sometimes you hear and obviously there's always, I guess, a certain amount of political machinations that go along with these things. But some people can be really kind of black-pilled about the floor committees. It sounds like you've served on the floor committees before. What kind of describe your experience in terms of the delegates who are on the floor committees actually trying to put the best stuff forward?
Sure. So the floor committees have a very, very difficult job to do. This time, for example, the seminary committee had 88 separate overtures they had to look at. They go down to St. Louis for basically a long weekend. They're taking their own time off to do that. And they have very intense sessions basically all day, reading through these things, preparing them, and distilling them into resolutions. I was on 3 floor committees. I was on universities twice. And last cycle, I was on theology and church relations. So I do have a great understanding and appreciation of what these folks are doing. And I thank them for their work. And I think that it's always helpful to approach these resolutions with the understanding that these are, fellow members of the church body that we're trying to do, hopefully, the best they can with the resolutions. Now, I will say that there is direction that comes to the floor committees, usually through the chairman. sometimes there are topics that people are told, well, this just isn't something we want to go with. And that is often positive. For example, in the seminary context, there are a lot of overtures looking for online seminaries and a bunch of other things. And I think President Harrison very wisely has suggested that's not the way we want to go. And that's okay. The other thing with the resolutions is there is sort of synod speak. And I actually, just for fun, as I was playing around with artificial intelligence, I asked the AI bot to draft a resolution in the style of Missouri Synod to take a particular position. And it came back, it was hilarious, because it said basically, well, here is what we want to do. And we recognize that a lot of people are doing the opposite. And we give thanks to those people for doing the opposite. We understand that they had good intentions, but for the good of the church, we really suggest that we take the position we're now recommending. And if you've ever read through a convention workbook or convention proceedings, you see a lot of that, because there's some issues we can speak directly on, but oftentimes there's a lot of fluff that's put in there for various reasons to sort of sugarcoat the message or avoid taking a strong position. And that's the frustration that I will have sometimes, that others will have with the floor committees, is just come out and say what you want. And for various reasons, there's a desire, and not always negative, there's a desire to be charitable. There's a desire to recognize, we're a church body and we don't want to be too harsh. I sometimes come across in print as a little bit harsh, but that is just the nature of the floor committees, and that's the way they've worked as long as I've observed them.
Yeah. So it's wise not, it's wise in this scenario not to attribute, too much political machinations behind it.
Well, there's always political machinations, but I think what I encourage people to do is just read the resolution and see if it makes sense, if you understand it. And you do have to look at the whereas clauses, because that is part of the resolution. A lot of people just skip down to the bottom and say, well, what is it? What are we doing? What do the resolved paragraphs say? And that's certainly the meat of the resolution. But the whereases are important as well, because those will get cited in the future, and it's all part of the convention proceedings. So, read through it, and, there are undercurrents sometimes in these that you can get, and you'll understand where the committee is going, where they speak strongly, where they speak weakly, where they say you shall do it, and where they say we encourage or we implore. They're just kind of asking. And that's part of that's the nature of the Synod itself, because there's some areas where the Synod has control, and there's some areas where the Synod is, in fact, advisory. And that also limits what the floor committees can do. They cannot tell you, for example, you must use page 15. Sadly, they cannot direct that to every congregation, because we have a congregational polity and we have, freedom in that respect.
Yeah. Very well. So where do you want to start with today's business?
Well, some of the overtures were declined, in particular 950 and 951 about using the title of bishop. That was sent by omnibus. Committees didn't want to deal with that. That may be a microaggression to some of the listeners here, using that title. Not going to be taken up at the convention, probably. So sorry to report that for those that are interested in the episcopae.
Yeah.
But going through this, there are a number that I think you can look at some of these things and say, here's a little tweak here and there. And that's something I would encourage people to send into the floor committees, because they're human, they make mistakes, and sometimes things could have been worded more clearly. So they will oftentimes, and when I was on the committees, we got these emails and notes, and then there's also open hearings at the convention. If you happen to be in Phoenix, you can go in Saturday morning and speak directly to the committees. Now, they're not going to debate you, and they have limited time, so that's why I suggest, even if you're going to go in person, send it in writing in advance. But
and make use of this process. It is the process we're given, right?
Yes, this is the process we're given. This is the process that's been in place for as long as I've been involved with Synod affairs. And you can actually have an impact by going in and talking, or by sending emails. We took them seriously when we received them on the committees. And this is the place where every individual person in the pew can have an impact and can weigh in if you so choose. Now, I'm not urging people to spam the committees. Like, take some time, read through it, and understand what they're saying. But if you have something that adds value, by all means, send it in. It's on page 13 of today's business. It gives you the list of the chairman of each of the floor committees and then an email address where you can submit your comments and, follow the directions. Make sure you put in the subject line what resolution you're talking about so that it can be routed to the right place. Mm-hmm. So I can just sort of run through some of the resolutions that I thought were of use or maybe of interest. Mm-hmm. 110 is under the National Witness Floor Committee, and they talk about confronting increased idolatry within our culture. And this is one of those quick hits where you might say, in the things that people are idolizing, they do mention careers. Something that directly impacts the worship life of a lot of congregations is youth sports. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's an idolatry that should be called out. Mm-hmm. When kids are not in church because they've got to do the travel ball. And there's nothing wrong with that, but not on Sunday morning.
Correct.
Committee 3, Mercy, has a overture. They took an overture and they created Resolution 301 to commend life ministry. One thing that seems to be glaringly omitted from that is assisted suicide. And we are both still in the state of Illinois where, sadly, this wicked practice was adopted by the legislature last year. Mm-hmm. There's a lawsuit challenging it, but this is something the church can and should speak out on boldly. And there's actually in the workbook, the CTCR has a report on this issue, but unfortunately there were no overtures on it, so it was not taken up by the committee. But the committees can look at reports and other things in the workbook to make a resolution. And so I would encourage people to reach out to Committee 3 and say, let's speak to this issue. This is something the church cannot be silent on.
Is there a particular resolution that you mentioned?
It could be added to 301, but they could also create a new resolution if they want to. In the workbook, there is, as I said, there is a CTCR report, and the committees can base resolutions on anything that's in the workbook. It could be an overture, it could be a report from a board, it could be the president's report, variety of things. Mm-hmm. So another item of particular concern to our audience here is Resolution 406 to bring back the Commission on Worship. And this is something that used to exist. It was removed as part of the restructuring process, and there's a proposal to bring it back. And it's going to be a 7-member commission. But guess what? 3 of those are going to be elected to the convention, but they're proposing that 4 of them would be appointed by the Synod president as well as the executive director. So it is very, very important to know who the Synod president is going to be. And Gottesdienst has encouraged supporters to vote for President Harrison, and I would second that. I think it is very important that we have a solid, faithful, confessional pastor in charge of appointing members to the Commission on Worship that's going to direct possibly a new hymnal for those that think we need one, other things in worship. That's a serious business. And if folks looked at, and thankfully this has been corrected, but some of the unusual worship practices that were going on at the St. Louis Seminary Chapel prior to the current presidency, I don't think we want that represented in our Commission on Worship.
Right.
So presidential voting for those that are electors starts on Saturday, continues through Tuesday. I'm not sure when this is going to run, but if you have that opportunity, by all means, I would encourage that vote. Mm-hmm. Moving to theology and church relations, this is a committee that I was served on last cycle, and they have a variety of assignments, including dealing with partner churches. There were overtures submitted on a couple of the partner churches that have problems, including the SELC in Germany and the AALC in the United States. And those were combined into Resolution 504, which the title is to address concerns with partner churches. And it references some of the things that were mentioned, but doesn't identify which partner church was involved with it. I would encourage people to perhaps suggest to the committee that they might strengthen this a bit and deal with specific issues. in the president's report, President Harrison says that the SELC has effectively allowed women preaching. And that is clearly not consistent with being a partner church of the LCMS, in my view. And I think that some of the statements in the report are perhaps overly enthusiastic. You can go back and look in the workbook. There's an overture on the SELC, actually submitted by my congregation. It lays out some particulars. And I think this is a very serious issue. We did withdraw fellowship last time from the Japan Lutheran Church on the issue of women's ordination. And in that resolution in 2023, the Synod repented of the fact that we were not on the ball on this topic. We let it slide for many years. And for our benefit, and also for the benefit of our brothers and sisters in Germany, we need to be very forthright about dealing with this issue and calling for repentance where that's needed. The AALC is a different situation. Their leadership has come out and made kind of what I consider very aggressive statements against the LCMS and certain aspects of our fellowship with them. Without getting into specifics, it is outlined in the overtures and in the report. They have accepted into their membership at least one individual that's been removed for cause from the roster of the Missouri Synod. And they have, at least according to their online posts, do not repent of this and knew the circumstances. And I think that's very troubling for a church body that's supposed to be united to us in doctrine and practice. And I think that needs to be addressed. Obviously, Resolution 504 does talk about this, and it encourages the Synod president to continue his efforts. And I know that President Harrison is trying to deal with these situations, but sometimes it needs a boost from the convention to say, hey, we as a convention are holding this accountable, and we want something done. An issue regarding public worship is Resolution 509 to address public reading of Scripture. And I'm happy to see this resolution because this comes from, in part, an overture that my congregation has submitted several times, basically saying that for the good of the church, it's helpful if the pastor reads the Scripture lessons in public worship in a regular worship service. And they do actually pick that up. And I think it's overall a very good resolution. And this is one where listeners might want to write in and say, hey, good job. Please keep this strong. Don't water it down. One thing I did notice, they reference 1 Timothy 4:13 as though that is the only passage dealing with this issue. And I'm not really sure why you would want to sort of proof text this if you're asking for theological analysis of the practice of public reading of Scripture. Because apparently the committee believes that the rationale is correct, that this is a function of the pastoral office because it's integral to proclaiming the word. But then they're asking the seminary faculties to study one single verse to think about it a little bit more. So that maybe they could clarify, but overall, this is a good one. Okay. Moving on, the Pastoral Ministry and Seminaries resolutions is a big part of the workbook. There were, as I said, 88 separate overtures, and there was a lot for this committee to deal with. I know they had a tough job. I know most of the people on that committee, and I think overall they've done very well in upholding our synod's practice of a unified pastoral formation system that actually brings men together to study at the feet of the doctors of the church, to have fellowship with one another, to interact, iron sharpening iron, as one might say, and then go out into the church wherever the church needs them, rather than limiting it to, well, you're in, Central Illinois, in your context, you can't possibly move. You need to go online or maybe study in a sort of siloed mentor model format and then just stay right where you are. I don't think that's beneficial for the church. And I think the committees, if you read through these resolutions, they're very carefully crafted in Committee 6, and I think mostly they've done well. I'm going to point out a couple things for listeners to be aware of. 606 and 609 are talking about the specific ministry pastor program. And right now, 75%, and you can look this up, there's nothing secret about this, 75% of the SMPs coming from St. Louis are going to multi-staff parishes. This program was sold as providing pastors for small, struggling congregations, maybe in inner city areas, maybe in rural areas where it's very hard to bring in and support a pastor. But that's not how it's being used. And the seminary boards have adopted criteria to limit or restrict who can come into the program. And that's drawn a tremendous amount of blowback from a number of districts and from a number of the strong consumers of the SMP program. And they've said, we want to go in the other direction. We want to repeal these. We want a wide open SMP. And in fact, the Council of Presidents has granted all of the exceptions to that policy that have been requested. So although there's been a lot of talk about it, the SMP guidelines that you may have heard about have actually not so far had any impact on the program. But they are saying aspirationally, we want younger men, especially, who have a full life of ministry ahead of them to go into the residential program, because that is the fullest and deepest training for a lifetime of ministry. We also have empirical evidence that the younger men that go in the SMP tend to be less likely to finish the program versus those that are over 40. So I don't know if this is trust no one under 40 or trust no one over 40, but that's the direction they're going. So also 609 calls on the Council of Presidents to finish up its oversight. This was from 2019. They're not done yet. And this is a recurring problem you will see in resolutions, is the references back to, well, 3 years ago, 7 years ago, we suggested that we should do such and such. And again, using the resolution language, we give thanks for everybody's hard work, and we're patient, and we encourage them to actually finish the job.
Yeah. So what's missing in that oversight?
Well, what's missing in that oversight is a specific ministry pastor is supposed to be called to a specific site. So it's not a general roster status.
Right.
He's called to a place. And if he wants to go somewhere else, first of all, he's not really supposed to be jumping around, but you have to identify another specific ministry. And also, he's supposed to be under supervision. They're supposed to be under supervision their entire careers. They're supposed to have a supervising pastor. And there is also another resolution dealing with that bylaw that helps them out and mentors them as long as they're on the SMP roster. Now, we hope, and there's a resolution on this too, that SMP guys that are out for a while, they can go back to the seminary, they can finish their coursework and become general pastors. And then they can do anything they want. Right. But that supervision has been it's been inconsistent, I think is a fair statement, between districts. So there are SMP guys that are put out there, and it's not fair to these men either, because they're expecting this infrastructure of support, and they're not getting it. And if you have a good winkle, if you have a good group in your circuit, they will help them out, and obviously, hopefully, do that fraternally. But that was not the original intention. They're supposed to be assigned a specific mentor pastor and work with that person, and that's not always happening.
Okay.
So one area where I will criticize Committee 6 is Resolution 610, and this is an Article 14 issue, in my opinion. Resolution 610 did not come from either seminary board. The seminary boards did not request this. It came from a different overture. And what it says is that adjunct seminary faculty do not receive a call to do that work. They're not entitled to receive a call or installation, and they don't have to be necessarily approved by the Board of Regents at each seminary. And I'm not sure how that is consistent with many of the statements in the other resolution that are extolling our residential seminaries in many ways, because there's such a vetting process by the Synod of the faculties. They go through prior approval, they're interviewed, they're voted upon. They are doctors of the church, and they receive that title, and that's a title of great dignity. That's an honor that should be afforded to those men that we have selected to form our future pastors. Concordia St. Louis has about 25% of our credit hours delivered through guest or adjunct faculty. That's
Whoa.
a lot.
Yeah.
It tends to be in the alternate routes, but it covers a lot of different areas. And we also have men that are teaching year in, year out. We had an individual that came from a partner church that was here several years teaching a full-time schedule and was never really didn't really ever get any formal recognition. I mean, he was on the website even, but he was never approved. So I think this is one that probably should be rejected. I think that there's always going to be explanations of, well, we had to have somebody come in and cover a class for a week while somebody was sick. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about individuals that are regularly year in, year out teaching, informing our seminarians. And I think that the church should honor them with a call and with recognition. So there's, all things be done decently in order. Give them a rightly ordered call.
Mm-hmm. It seems like it would be not that difficult to have a general category that you're going to go through a process of approval and actual calling instead of sort of what's happening now. It wouldn't add that much, would it?
Well, I don't think so. I was on the universities committee when we did this for adjuncts at the colleges and universities in the theology area. And we brought a resolution through that said that if you're teaching more than 1 year in any 3 in a theology class, you should go through the formal process. And we heard the same kind of objections at that point that, it's going to be burdensome and so forth. But, they got it done. And once you process the initial group, they tend to come back year after year. So you're not having to do this every year for 30 or 40 people. But, obviously there's some work up front. But, hey, we install, if an ordained man is an admissions officer, he gets installed. The Synod has a document called Call versus Contract, which for more than 40 years says that if you're a rostered worker and you're working for an agency of the church in a job that requires a rostered worker, you're entitled to the dignity and protection of a call. Right. That's been consistent across the line, and I think that that's the appropriate way to go. So on the topic of prior approval, there were a number, and our district convention passed one of these, and I think there was a model that was going around, requests for openness in the prior approval process.
Can you just describe prior approval for anyone who's unfamiliar with it?
Yeah, so prior approval is applicable for college and university presidents. And that is where I think most of these overtures came from. So we all know Concordia, Texas. Concordia, Texas, Don Christian, who was the president down there, was called in an irregular process by their Board of Regents because they believed that he would not receive prior approval. Prior approval says if you want to be, and the bylaws changed, but the way it works now is a Board of Regents will select a pool of candidates, and they are submitted to a 3-person panel, the president of the Synod, the chairman of the Concordia University System Board, and the district president who is serving on the institution's board. 2 of those 3 can veto any of those candidates to be a president of a college or university. And it is not just President Harrison. It is the people that are not happy say, oh, Harrison did this and Harrison did that. Well, no, there are 3 people and they come from 3 different places. So there are different voices being heard. And this is part of the system of checks and balances in terms of who becomes an institution president and how do we make sure that our institutions stay on a faithful and confessional path. So, as I said, Don Christian was called irregularly, and President Harrison, I think in an attempt to be magnanimous, allowed him to become president, even though he had never gone through the prior approval in advance. And we saw how that all ended up. So there was some unhappiness up at Concordia University, Wisconsin, when Dr. Ankerberg was called as president, because some individuals thought that other people should have been allowed to come through. Right. And what they want is basically the committee, the prior approval panel, to say, here's why we vetoed you. And that is not a good idea for a variety of reasons. I've had experience with this several times going with prior approval panels. When we called Dr. Gard to be president at Concordia University, Chicago. There were 5 very solid confessional men on that list. 2 of them did not receive prior approval. I don't know why. No one told me why. But to say that, their orthodoxy was in question is absolutely false, because no one ever raised that issue. The argument from some on the maybe missional side is, they're not Lutheran enough. You'll hear that word bandied about. Well, that's not true. In a separate situation, I was involved with a search for an individual to fill a particular administrative position. And we had a candidate who was as orthodox as the day is long, wonderful man, totally not qualified for the job that he was asked to do. Mm-hmm. So would it have been helpful for the prior approval panel to issue a public statement saying, we vetoed Dr. Schmidt, and obviously that's not his name. Mm-hmm. We vetoed Dr. Schmidt because he's just incompetent for this job. Is that speaking of your brother in the kindest way? I know you all like the new translation of the Catechism. I'll say, is that putting the best construction on it? No. So this is a black box process, and it's not simply, here are the 10 things you need to check off and you get prior approval. It is, if I dare say, a holistic assessment of who is the individual. Is this individual best suited to serve in this position for himself? And is he best suited to serve in this position for the institution? And it may be a theological issue, but it may not. It may simply be the person has a different skill set. The person has maybe family circumstances that people don't know about. It could be any number of things. So the resolutions that have come out from the committee are called to clarify the prior approval protocols. And they're asking for articles to be written in the Lutheran Witness to explain this process, and maybe for specific criteria to be, or a protocol to be suggested for certain cases. And I think that's okay. I think these resolutions are fine. You may see on the convention floor people saying, well, I want transparency. Well, I like transparency. I am generally pro-transparency. But if one, for example, if one is up for a parish call and you don't get it, what you don't do is issue a press release saying, we had 4 men on our call list. Here are the 3 that weren't called, and here's why they weren't called. Mm-hmm. No, you don't do that. And that's what this process is. These are call processes. And that is why I think, love it or hate it, this is the process we need to keep. We've got multiple voices in the room every time you do a prior approval. And I think we need to, at some respect, trust those that are in this process, because that's the way the church has been doing it.
Yeah.
A couple, getting into the weeds a little bit, and this is a very technical, for reasons that I will explain, bylaw resolution. And a lot of times you will get these bylaw resolutions at convention, and they go on and on and on, and people's eyes glaze over. Here's one, Resolution 911, to amend bylaw section 1.5, etc., to unify in the bylaws and revise corporate formation requirements for instrumental entities of corporate synod and agencies of the synod. That's a mouthful. Mm-hmm. This resolution goes on for 13 and a half pages. And I would challenge anybody to read through, and I've read through this. I've read through a couple drafts of it. It was presented to our boards to look at. It's there's a lot in here, and I think there's a lot of risk in here. So Let me try to explain what this is. There have been efforts at various entities saying, we've got some real estate or we've got some property that we want to monetize. We're a church. We closed our school. We got a big school building. We want to sell it off. And oftentimes they just sell it off. But there are a desire among, the LCEF, among other things, and also some of these agencies to say, what if we got in the real estate development business? Wouldn't it be nice if we were able to enter into, say, a private equity partnership? And private equity is actually specifically mentioned in this resolution, which I don't know if that's ever been the case in the Missouri Synod if we're starting to talk about stuff like this. It says the proposal develops a richer taxonomy of instrumental entities described below, granting the BOD authority to grant certain exceptions for agencies below the level of synod-wide corporates, districts, educational institutions, etc., and to allow formation of certain specific types of instrumental entities as other than agencies when the agency conventions do not make sense. Okay, so again, what do we want to do? We want to create, and this is maybe pejorative, we want to create shell companies, subsidiaries of, for example, a university or a seminary that can hold real estate and develop it without the burdensome requirements of synod bylaws. So what are we doing?
Is it burdensome bylaws, or do the bylaws not account for it or allow for it?
The bylaws don't account for it. So the synod...
So they're asking permission, or...
What this is doing is it would allow 4 different types of agencies to be created. Because right now, if you create an agency, first of all, there are very specific requirements on what you can do. A university cannot just go out and create an LLC, buy a new campus without a reversionary clause, and then say, well, we have this LLC and, we want to go borrow money against it, and this is not the property of Synod.
Right.
That has happened, and I'm not going to get into, it's not Texas, I'm not going to get into the specifics on this podcast, but we've got some issues here because people feel that they don't want to go through all the hoops of the Synod. And I've been through this a couple times with the seminary, and we're not obviously trying to do anything untoward. We are in total alignment with the board of directors. We are working with them. We talk to the CCM, and we've had a couple occasions where the CCM has said, this doesn't quite work. Now, our reaction to that is not to go and do it. Our reaction is, we are part of the Synod, and we are going to respect the requirements of the church, and that's what we've done. And none of this has really ultimately caused us any problems. But the rationale of this is, we want to do this real estate development activity. We want to be able to do joint ventures. Say you're out in, say, Silicon Valley, and you want to sell your parking lot to be developed, but you want to keep an income stream from that, and you want to create a special entity. Because remember, Synod entities have to be controlled by LCMS members. Mm-hmm. Your board of directors has to have 100% LCMS membership in order to be an agency of Synod. And if you're working with a real estate developer, they're going to say, well, I want to be on that board, or maybe I want to control that board, and you have nothing to say about it, but we'll give you a check every month. So what this is doing is allowing you to do that. You can create a subsidiary which is not majority governed by the LCMS members, and which can be a passive investor in private equity partnerships, real estate development, a variety of things. So that's all well and good, maybe, but what it also says in here is the property of that entity is not the property of Synod. Because right now, if you're a seminary, you're a university, your property is property of Synod. There's supposed to be a reversionary clause in there that says that if you go away, if you go out of business, if you dissolve, if you leave the Synod, guess what? The Synod gets your property back. And of course, the Concordia, Texas lawsuit is all about that issue. This is saying you can drop property down into one of these entities, you can go borrow money, and the Synod doesn't own that property anymore. The Synod would have a right in like the parent entity, but not the property. And I know that a lot of work has been spent on this, and I think the BOD, the Board of Directors of Synod, believes that this is a good idea and that they can control this because there are a lot of safeguards in here in theory. The Board of Directors would have to review the bylaws of all of these new companies. They'd have to approve them. There'd have to be financial reporting and so forth. But my issue is this really the core competency of our church body? And is this what we want to spend our time doing? Because I've seen even the entities we have a lot of trouble managing. Look at what happened with Portland. Look at what happened with Texas. And those were big entities that everybody was paying attention to, and yet we still had problems with them. So if you're going to create possibly dozens of different companies, the board of directors is going to have to spend time looking at these. They may have to spend legal fees. And that's not ultimately, for me, what we want our church body to be focused on, because we've all only got so much bandwidth, so much time. I think I would prioritize spiritual matters. The Lutheran Church Canada got into a big real estate development deal, and it bankrupted one of their districts. So I think there's a lot of risk here. My recommendation, I think there is a valid reason to do some of these things. I'm not saying anybody that is involved in this is a bad person, because again, I think they really care about funding the mission, and they see this as maybe this is a great way to do it. I would say let the board of directors deal with this on a case-by-case basis. If you come in and you say, here's a really great idea, this doesn't quite fit within the bylaws right now, can we get a waiver of this requirement? I trust the BOD to look at that and say, yes, no, or here's what we would do. But I'm not comfortable totally revamping the so-called taxonomy of entities, because like the SMP itself, the arguments in support of it are one thing, but I think we may find out that it gets used for something quite different. So I would look at this one with a great deal of caution and see if maybe it could be narrowed a bit. And I'm not sure what's going to happen with this. As I said, it's 13 pages long. I'm not sure even if the people on that floor committee can totally explain what it does, but we'll see.
Yeah.
So a last thing I'd like to talk about is Resolution 1002, which deals with the dispute resolution bylaws. And this is an issue that's been festering for a long time. There's a long history of this. Dr. Martin Noland wrote a paper on this, which I would encourage people to look up on the internet and learn about the history of how the LCMS dispute resolution process has reshaped over the years. The problem with the current process is it is all about reconciliation, and reconciliation is godly. That is something, if I have a dispute against you, first of all, I can guarantee we're both sinners, and there's probably going to be sinful activity involved on one or both of our parts. But reconciliation is appropriate where I've wronged you, I need to be reconciled to you, or you've wronged me, and I need to explain to you why that's happened. It's not really appropriate for things that are black and white doctrinal issues. So if someone is... and I don't want to get into specific examples here, but if there's a clear violation of scriptural teaching, then someone is teaching evolution, for example. That's not something to be reconciled like, oh, I just need to understand where you're coming from. That's like, brother, I call you to study the scriptures. I call upon you to repent, but if you don't do that, we need to deal with that issue. Yeah. And unfortunately, what's happened in the last few years, especially the proliferation of internet communications, is there's a perception that by going on the internet and engaging in flame wars is the only way to get action taken. And that's maybe true, maybe not. I mean, I think in a lot of cases, there are situations being dealt with, but because of the bylaws, no one can say anything about it. So from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. And I've got a good friend who's a district president, and he said, I had a serious problem with a pastor in my district. It took me 3 years to get rid of this guy, and then he's spending, many hours a week on these documentation for the bylaws and everything like that. And that doesn't seem right either. It seems to me that we hear a lot about Matthew 18, but the Bible talks about dispute resolution in a lot of different verses. For example, against an elder, don't receive an accusation but by 2 or 3 witnesses. But what else does it say? It says, rebuke him publicly because it's for the sake of his hearers. Right. And that's the part that's missing from our current dispute resolution bylaws, in my view. It should be have due process, make sure we protect everybody's rights, but deal with the issue. It should not take a minimum of 1 year, which is what the current bylaws require. And if there's a public issue, it should be spoken publicly. This person was removed for cause. Now, obviously, I'm not saying if there's a victim involved. we want to protect those people. So we don't want to do anything that's going to divulge the identity of a victim or something like that. But if someone is standing up at the pulpit and publicly preaching false doctrine and he gets removed for that issue, it should be explained, this is what happened and this is why. So President Harrison has called for, and there's also been overtures, creating a task force to study this issue. And I definitely agree with that. It's very complex. It's not something that can probably be dealt with by a floor committee to say, okay, we're going to draft up a new dispute resolution process for the Synod. My concern, though, is the membership of the task force that they're proposing.
Yeah, I was just asking about that.
Yeah.
Just going to, I mean.
So the task force says that it will be 7 members: the president of Synod, again, very important who gets elected, the secretary of Synod, and then 3 district presidents and 2 district secretaries selected by the Council of Presidents for each region. And then they're going to talk to reconcilers and current facilitators. So this is where, and they've got direction in here. Look at the problems of the process too expensive, it takes too long, provide clear guidance on what's public and what's private, what's face-to-face and what's electronic. But I am looking at who the membership of the task force is. These are all people that are working within the current system. And you need that. You need people to understand this is what we're doing now. Mm-hmm. But if you ask people that are all doing it now, they're going to have a vested interest perhaps in maintaining that or defending that. I'm not sure that if you only talk to the reconcilers, what are they going to say? Well, they're going to say, we want more reconciliation, because that's their job. They're called to reconcile, and they're going to want that. I would urge the committee to broaden this group a bit and say, why don't we have parish pastors that actually have to deal with this? Maybe they could be the subject of a complaint. Maybe they're initiating a complaint. But look at the people who actually have to use the system, not only the people that administer the system. Mm-hmm. And this may come across as self-serving, and I'm certainly not angling for this position, but I do think you also need some people with legal expertise to look at the system and say, does this make sense? Is this understandable? Is this sort of a due process system? How does this work? Versus, ecclesiastical individuals who maybe have used it but don't understand, what is competent evidence? How do you develop a record? Things of that nature. I think it would greatly benefit if you had a little bit broader perspective than just who does the COP think ought to be drafting the guidelines, because the COP has their own, that they do their own thing, and they have great responsibility, and there are many, many fine men on there, but you tend to get in any organization an echo chamber, and I think you'll do better if you were to broaden this resolution to include a task force that's more representative of the rank and file polity of Synod.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned due process, but it seems like with the reconciliation process, like all discussion of just adjudicating something has gone away.
A lot of it has. I mean, they do reach a decision at the end of the day, but oftentimes it's confidential, and so you can't even talk about it. And the other thing is you'll have an individual sometimes can resign from the roster, and it's not really publicized. And again, I don't like to get into too many specifics here because I'm not familiar with these cases, and I don't want to say that I know the facts because I don't. But there was some controversy a while back about a pastor in Virginia, and he resigned from the roster. So it is a matter of fact that he is no longer on the roster of the Missouri Synod. Mm-hmm. What we don't know is why. I mean, he's not obligated to tell us why, and the ecclesiastical supervisor is not obligated to tell us why. But what we also don't have is a definitive answer. Was he doing anything wrong? Right. So, this is for the reputation. Sometimes people can resign for a variety of reasons. They may just be burned out. They may have, health problems of some kind. And no one really knows. Like all of a sudden, you just see a line in the reporter, so-and-so is no longer on the roster. Well, then people speculate, and that's not charitable. That's, we should not be engaged in speculation. But if it is a case where someone was involved in false teaching, the welfare of the hearers also needs to be taken into account. So I think this is a good first step. But again, I think it would be better if you had a broader group of people formulating this process. And I would like to go back to a more judicial type system where you make your case and you reach a decision if it is in fact a doctrinal type issue and not merely, well, you made the carpet red in the chancel. I think it should have been blue. My grandmother always wanted the red carpet. She donated the last carpet, so I'm angry with you. Well, that kind of thing, you just need to be reconciled to your brother, but not if someone is preaching false doctrine.
Right.
So I've talked a lot. Is there anything you wanted to ask about any of the?
So, just overall, your sense, sometimes people kind of go to the convention with some foreboding of contention. Do you have any sense of what will be contentious or not?
I think the seminary stuff will be very contentious. I think there is a very well-organized movement, and you see it on YouTube, you see it in podcasts, to broaden the routes to formation. Mm-hmm. The arguments that are made are supposed pastoral shortage out there, although, again, the existing alternate route guys, vast majority going to places that already have pastors. So I'm not sure how valid that is. They will always use the example of, I've got a small congregation in the middle of the city that's only got 20 people. Well, that may be true, but can you pay a pastor? And even if you have a pastor who comes from an online seminary, how would you be able to pay him versus somebody who came from St. Louis or Fort Wayne? So I think there's going to be very strong efforts to deal with that issue. I think there's going to be some talk about the prior approval situation and some sort of leftover grievances from the closure of Ann Arbor. There is a desire to look at some sort of broadening of, doctrinal issues. For example, maybe there'll be some pushback on the open communion discussions. And then obviously the results of the presidential election, whichever way it goes, is going to have an impact, because if there's a new president, the people that maybe like President Harrison are going to be saying, well, maybe we don't want to give the president a lot of new powers that he doesn't already have if we did not vote for this person. And then vice versa. You may see people, if President Harrison is reelected, God willing, there will obviously be a vacancy in 2029. So people may be posturing for that. So It's hard to say. I think there is a lot of energy on both sides. And I think the pastoral formation seems to be the biggest single issue that people are talking about.
Yeah. Do you have a sense, as someone who has been a delegate and served on these commissions, is it better when there's a little more contention, a little more engagement, as opposed to, all quiet on the Western Front?
I think there is. And this is one area where I would agree with some folks like Zach Zender and Tim Allman, who I may not agree with on certain theological topics, but I think it is necessary for people to talk honestly about what is going on in the Synod and issues where there are real differences. Mm-hmm. There's been a desire to say everything is calm, everything is peaceful because all the resolutions are passing 85% or whatever the number is. And they don't all pass, but a lot of them do. And a lot of them really aren't that controversial. I mean, we're encouraging educating our youth. Nobody's opposed to that. I mean, a lot of the stuff in here is really, I don't want to say vanilla because it's important, but it's not something that is controversial right now. But we've got to be talking about things. I think it is healthy if we are actually looking at particularly the scriptural and confessional bases of why we take certain positions. Not merely like this is what the bylaws say, but like really dig into it and make sure we can defend our positions, because that makes us stronger. If we just assume that everybody's on the same page and it's getting hollowed out within, we may wake up someday and find out, like what happened with Seminex, that our scriptural foundations are being undermined because people weren't talking about it. I mean, some were, but a lot of people weren't until it really blew up. So I think it's healthy to have debate. Hopefully it's constructive debate. Hopefully it's talking about, okay, here's my position on this issue. Here's why Scripture supports this. Here's why the confessions support this. Not, I don't like you because X, Y, Z. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of that. There are some personal issues that come up, and that's unfortunate. But I think if we actually talk about our theology, we're stronger because there's such depth there, and we do have a very well-informed ministerium and laity, and let's use that to make the best arguments we can.
Yeah. Do you? I mean, just as an aside, I guess. Do you think that the synod meeting and convention like this still affords that ability to discuss those things openly, or do you think the structure of it is such that, and it only happens over a few days, that it just doesn't actually afford that opportunity?
Yeah, anytime you get 1,000 people together, there's only so much you can do. Mm-hmm. And of course, a lot of the time is also used for things like SAS, presentations. Obviously, we do vote on electing officers of the synod other than the president. They will all be voted on at the convention. So time is spent on that. So there's always a desire to have more time. One thing there is going on this year is the omnibus the consent agenda, which is something new. And they're going to, and this has been done informally, they've sort of, you remember bundling, where the president will stand up and say, here are 3 resolutions from this mercy committee. We're going to bundle them and vote on them as a group. They're going to do that formally and have a consent agenda where there is no debate on certain things that are considered to be not controversial. That can be beneficial. It can also be dangerous if there's an attempt to put things in there that really should be talked about. There is an ability, I think, in the standing rules that 10% of the delegation can ask for something to be brought to the floor and not put in the consent agenda. Mm-hmm. So some things are going to get debated. I think there will be a lot of debate on the seminary stuff. I think there'll be time spent on that. That's helpful. I would personally like to see more debate on various things, but there are time constraints. And as the old saying goes, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So sometimes you have really good debate, and sometimes you just get into either filibustering or just people going back and forth and not really speaking to the issue at hand. So, yeah, I mean, it's tough in a large meeting to have really thoughtful discussion, but I think generally we do a pretty good job of it with the time that we have. So, again, if you're a delegate, don't be afraid to go to the microphone. Think about what you're going to say and think about what is thoughtful and how to be succinct. And it's not easy for everybody to do that. But, if you have a valid opinion, don't be afraid to go to the microphone.
Yeah. And be clear about what you're asking from the body.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, give it some thought and, listen to what people are saying. If you're a new delegate, maybe don't jump to the microphone on the first resolution that comes up, because some of these things, as I said, are really not that, they don't merit a lot of discussion time at the microphone. It may be best to just move on so we can save our time for something that's really significant where a lot of people are going to want to have a say. Mm-hmm. But don't be intimidated. I mean, every delegate is on an equal footing. Everybody has one vote. And, look at the scriptures, look at the confessions, use your common sense. You don't have to check that at the door. And decide, if we adopt this or if we vote this down, what's going to be best for the church and what is this actually doing? And do try to read through the documents, because they get read, the resolves get read, but some of these are very long and they won't read everything. And things can go fast on the convention floor, so do your homework in advance.
Yeah. Do the committees come up in order, or how is the agenda set? And does the body have the ability to request, when everyone's still fresh and excited to be there, to bring some of those things forward that need a little more discussion?
Yes. So if you look on page 5 of today's business, it has the tentative schedule of the convention. That's pretty much how it's going to go. So the floor committees come up based on where they can fit them in, based on how much material they have. They're not necessarily in numerical order. Some of them get only one time at the microphone if they don't have a lot of items, like, say, finance. Some of them, like seminaries, will have multiple times at the microphone on the podium because they've got a lot of material to cover. The convention can extend or change the agenda if they want to. Sometimes you get to the end of what's called the orders of the day. So if they've allotted 40 minutes for Committee 6, they get to the end of that, the presiding officer can ask the convention, do you want to allow more time on this? And that takes, I think, a 2/3 vote to modify the orders of the day, but that can be done. And then there's also unallocated time on the last day if things don't get finished. But the convention is very expensive to run, so they do, like at 5 o'clock, they're going to hammer it down every day, and that's that. It's not going to continue. They only will extend within the convention day, and that doesn't happen that much, although it can happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for your time and your insight on these things, and for reading through all of these resolutions. It can be, well, I mean, for someone like me, it's very dry.
It is very dry, and of course, there are many gifts in the body. My gift is reading through minutia, so I'm happy to deploy that in service to the church.
Yeah, well, we appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Pastor Braaten. It's great talking with you, and God's blessings to you and the Gottesdienst crowd.
All right, same to you.